just introduce the book and sort of describe what the gift of injury is about, and also what kind of made you decide to write the book? It sort of comes from a slightly different perspective of your other books. So how did that all come about?
Yes, it is a bit of a different book. And it wasn't something I anticipated. It grew very organically. In the beginning, I ended up seeing Brian Carroll, who, if people are in the strength or powerlifting world, would know that name as a record holder in two, or I think it was three different weight categories at different times. And he came to see me as a back pain patient. And it was funny. I didn't realize the dark place he had come from, and how, well, as it describes in the book, he had been given these prognoses from a neurosurgeon and an orthopedic surgeon, and he was considering taking his own life at this point with no way out. But somehow he ended up flying up to Canada. And I said to him, well, I don't know if I can get you out of pain. I will try. But here's my suggestions. And he said, but I also want the next world record. And I said, well, if you were my son, I would advise you against that. But how about this for a deal? Try and execute what we have recommended here. And then if we are successful in getting you out of pain, I'll need you to come back and bring your wife. And with my wife, the four of us will go out to dinner and we'll discuss whether you really want to risk it all and go for the next record. Well, as you know, that's exactly what happened. And he did come back and win once again. So the gift of injury was really as many record-setting athletes have found out when they've come here. They'll tell you, we didn't set a record until after our back injury. And the back injury taught us to pay more attention to the science of injury mechanics and the science of training. And that was the gift, to incorporate science to extend their capacity, or the tipping point. And when you cross the tipping point, you get hurt. When you're underneath the tipping point, it's very anabolic. You build your body. So it's a science to know where the tipping point is and then extend it as much as you can, and then use science just to stay under it. Train well and don't cross it. So that's my first answer to where that all came about. But as we started to kick around this idea of writing a book, and I flew down to Florida and spent quite a number of days with Brian discussing how we would shape the message on this. As you said, it's a different book for me. And then it did start out as Brian's story and the science of bone callousing, and because people don't realize he had a horrific injury. He'd split his sacrum front to back. He'd crushed L5, the vertebra, and the discs above and below were very badly damaged. So in telling his story and then the science of getting his rehab organized and his training done once again, we'd never told the story before from the personal perspective. And people thought, oh, well, they've heard about McGill's work and they read in a popular magazine, and the magazines always want a sound bite, and they usually go for the big three, and here's the magical 3 exercises to get out of pain. And that's not it at all, as you know. It's about understanding what the mechanism of pain in that person and specifically addressing it. So it was really the first time that people started to realize that we went far beyond just getting people out of pain and finishing off the final objective of getting them back to doing what they love to do, and whether that was just playing recreational sport themselves, or it was going for the world record in or getting a gold at the Olympics or whatever it happened to be.
And in the book, you sort of obviously talk very specifically around Brian's injury. Is it written with like powerlifting and strength athletes in mind, or can other sports people read the book, to some degree understand the principles within it and maybe follow those principles, and not necessarily some of the actual specifics that you do talk about? Because obviously when you talk, there's a lot of you talking and then Brian talking, and then you sort of mash the two together to be able to in a sense sort of bring out the result of the exercises to do and this and that and the other. But is it useful for other sports people, be it American footballers or soccer players or rugby players or whoever it may be?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you used the terms principles and then specifics. So the principles are ruled by science. They're universal. That's biology and psychology and all the rest of it. So yes, the principles are broadly applicable, those being you have to have an assessment that reveals the causal mechanism of the pains and loss in performance and all that kind of thing. But then how that is addressed. There are principles within each category, but there are also specifics to sport. Let's take an example of a tennis player or a basketball player. They both, in terms of a principle, require core stability and hip mobility. But then we get into the specifics of that. So we would build the core, which would then allow them to unleash their hips and then start working on footwork. And in both of those sports, one of the primary footwork mechanics would be what's called the drop step. So if you're standing square, you would lift the right leg off the ground, turn it outwards, and take a step back. So you can imagine boxing out an opponent in basketball, rebounding under the basket, or you could imagine a forehand in tennis where you would drop step, turn the body, swing the racket with sufficient core stiffness, shoulder and hip mobility to really put some speed on the ball. If they were doing a backhand shot, they drop step with the left. So there's an example where we would take a primary athleticism like that in terms of a principle and drill it with specifics, but both required a foundation. Because that person was coming out of a weakness and a pain history, we had to address that first. Building their core, giving them the appropriate mobility, and then add in the skill of speedy footwork. So that's my answer. Yeah, the principles are universal, but the specifics are obviously sport specific. So that means you have to know something about the sport, and obviously this book was biased towards the strength athlete. My other book, Ultimate Back Fitness and Performance, would have a broader spectrum of sport endeavors.